Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started here. Thanks for coming the second morning after our breakout session for floodplain management. I'd like to introduce our first and only set of speakers today. The two following presentations for floodplain management. If you didn't hear the announcement this morning, we're unable to travel because of slick roads in eastern Iowa, so I can go ahead and say this is going to be the most exciting presentation in the floodplain management track today. So we're going to have flood preparedness tools for Iowa. We have with us Jeff Zogg from the National Weather Service. Jeff is a senior hydrologist and meteorologist at the National Weather Service in Des Moines. Kris is Central Regional Coordinator for NOAA, National Weather Service Flood Forecast Inundation Mapping Program. And Nate Young, the Associate Director of the Iowa Flood Center, is here. So I don't know the order that they're going to speak, so I'll just turn it over to them.
Thank you. The opening comments will be, we have 4 topics that we're going to focus our discussion on today. And in the middle of these 4 topics, we're also going to do a live demonstration of the mapping products on both IFAS and on NWS AHAP. So that's kind of the structure of this panel discussion. And this initiative began with a collaborative project between the National Weather Service and also the Iowa Flood Center, where we realized an opportunity to share data, and that's what this discussion is all about, is the value of sharing data and what it can do for the communities in Iowa that are using these tools to help them prepare for flood mitigation and flood loss. Nate is going to kick off the first topic question. And for the first question, we're going to focus on the importance of the flood inundation mapping projects to support preparedness at the local and community level.
So I think I'll just kind of share our personal experience at the flood center at Inception. As many of you might be aware, the flood center was created as a result of the 2008 flood in eastern Iowa. And our personal experience in Iowa City was that as the Weather Service was making forecasts, it was very difficult for the local citizens or even us as water resources professionals to translate river forecasts made at stage at one discrete location to potential flood impacts in the community. And I think that speaks to the motivation for the flood center products, but I think also it kind of in parallel to the AGIPS products that the Weather Service has produced, and also some of the innovation mapping initiatives that the USGS has created. They all kind of center around the idea that we want to be able to communicate flood information effectively to the general public. And doing so by making a forecasting stage at a discrete location just wasn't sufficient. So we began developing these maps, posting them online, and designed our interface in such a way also that we could the broad community in Iowa, hoping to empower them to make informed decisions about how to manage their own properties, both during a flood event and also in the near future and distant future, making good decisions about how to manage their land, where to build, where not to build, etc.
And excuse me, I'll talk about the community involvement, which is a very important part of the process, because in order for the map to be useful, it needs to have buy-in from local officials. And that's one of the things that we do during the process, is we engage local community officials in the development of the maps. Because the local officials, they know the community better than we do at the National Weather Service or even the Flood Center, because that's where they spend the majority of their time. So at the local community level, we will ask them to maybe review maps, give us input into sensitive locations, maybe vulnerabilities that we may not be aware of, to be sure that we can verify on the maps that it is showing that vulnerability. And during the process, we would engage them at various points to show them what we have and ask for input from them as far as, is this accurate? Does this make sense at this given stage? Based on your experience in your community, what are you seeing versus what this map is showing? And we would take that input and maybe make tweaks to the library of maps, again with the goal ultimately of having something that is useful to them, because we found that if we engage the stakeholders in the process and solicit that input during the process, the end result is more likely to be embraced by the local community.
That trust factor is very important when you're developing these maps. And keep in mind that these are non-regulatory maps. These are not flood insurance rate maps. These are supplemental products that folks are using to understand what their flood risk. Essentially gives them the ability to put a stream gauge in the backyard of anybody in the community and know what their flood risk is, or know what that stage or what that critical stage is that's going to impact them. It's going to impact their route to work. It's going to cause roads to be overtopped and critical infrastructure to be cut off during the event. It gives them the ability to place that stream gauge anywhere within that community. And in order to get people to use those tools, it is critical that we get that trust factor established and to get the local authorities, the city engineers, the city emergency management that are the respective leaders within the community to understand what it is we're trying to accomplish with these projects, and to take that message and carry it forward to the community so that they can push the idea of using this for their own preparedness activities. So that's very important, that trust factor, and establishing that trust factor is critical. And as Jeff mentioned, the ability to get in there and start that conversation about flood risk and about flooding issues within the community. During that process, we discovered things that we didn't know before. It's critical to get that going because we can't do these projects in a vacuum. So when we go in there and we start that conversation, we'll find out that, hey, there's a levee around this water treatment plant, and that water treatment plant's obviously a very important part of the critical infrastructure, and they just redid a flood wall. That flood wall is not visible within the LiDAR or within any of the other supplemental data that we're using to model and build these mapping products. So those types of conversations not only establish a trust factor, but add value to the end product, making sure that we know exactly what the issues are in the community and what the infrastructure impacts are going to be, and making sure we have the most up-to-date and critical data.
So I'd just like to give a demonstration of both sets of products. I'll start with the Iowa Flood Center's Iowa Flood Information System. And before I begin, I'll just introduce Dr. Ibrahim Demir, who's the developer of IFAS. He's here with us today. Also have Mr. Dan Gillis, who is one of the primary engineers that does all the modeling and survey work to support these efforts. And then Tony Loger, who also, in addition to being our session chair, is also as a Flood Center employee and heavily involved in our mapping activities. I know we've got a lot of extra time afterwards, so if any of you have any questions or would like to investigate some of our data for your own personal community, any of us would be happy. So with that, I'll just go to IFAS. This is a web-based interface located at ifas.iowafloodcenter.org. It not only features inundation mapping, but rainfall data, river gauge data, any number of flood relevant data sets from the Weather Service, the USGS, the Flood Center, and other resources all consolidated into one location. But for today, we'll focus on the inundation maps. You can either go access them through this Launch IFAS button, where you can access all the features, or there's a more direct method to get to the maps, this little shortcut button. So these are all the communities that we've mapped as of a few weeks ago. We've got several new ones that just came online. I'll show you another map here shortly of the additional communities that become available recently. If you click on any one of them, gives you an opportunity to load the flood maps for that community. Gives you a little bit of information about which USGS stream gauge the maps are referencing. Of course, these are all at locations where the Weather Service is making a stage forecast during an event. Ames is a little bit of a unique situation because we've got both the Skunk River and Squaw Creek as major flood sources in the community. So in order to address both of them, we had to run several simulations with various flow scenarios, contributing flows from each stream. So the first set of information we can show is just based on river stage. You can go in and change the river stage at the upstream gauge on the Skunk, and also increase its corresponding river flow. You can also independently increase the stage and river flow on Squaw Creek, and it combines the flows and calculates an inundation map for the community for each of these scenarios. As you can see, we're referencing the stage and discharge in the upstream gauges, and then down below we've got the stage and combined discharge on the steps of the local confluence. We also have maps based upon return period. As Kris pointed out, these are not regulatory maps. These are maps that we developed, but they give you a sense for long-term risk. So instead of just tracking potential risk during an event with a given forecast, now you can consider, say, for a 2-year flood, 5, 10, all the way up to a 500-year flood, what your personal flood risk might be at your property, and make informed decisions about how to manage your property using these data. During an event, we display real-time stage values, so these are connected to the observations made at the USGS gauge and the forecast made by the National Weather Service. So instead of a slider reflecting stage and discharge, now it's reflecting time. And of course, there's not much going on right now, so there's not really much to see. You can move the slider back and forth during an event, see past observations and the corresponding inundation, and also look at the forecasted river stages and corresponding inundations with that as well. We'll postpone any questions to the end. So before I turn it over to Weather Service, I just did want to share with you this map showing our currently available communities and our planned communities in the next several months. So everything in dark blue is currently available or will be available next week when we release our latest version of IFIS. And then the remaining 4 that are of the lighter color blue are ones that we're going to be working on and releasing later this year. Thanks for your time. Just want to switch straight.
Okay. Now I'm going to jump over to the NWS AHAB's webpage. I've already got one map pulled up, but I'm going to actually jump backwards here and show you where to find this information. If you go into water.weather.gov, you're going to get the AHAB's page here with all the green and yellow and purple and red dots. At the bottom of this page, there's a little link here that says inundation mapping locations. That's one way to find it, or you can simply go to the forecast location of the gauge nearby. I'll show you the locations in Iowa where we have these installed, and you can take a look that way. And not so good with the trackpad, so I'll do my best to zoom in here. But you can see the 5 locations within Iowa here where we have these mapping products collaboratively developed at the Iowa Flood Center, Winnebago River in northern Iowa here at Mason City, the Cedar River at Waterloo, and also at Cedar Falls. And we also have another one installed at Cedar River, at Cedar Rapids, and then also at Iowa City here. Iowa River, Iowa City. Okay, so the one that I'm going to show you is the Waterloo map. And when you load up the web page here, the first thing I'm going to show you is go to the inundation mapping page. Obviously, you're going to get the inundation map first, but it is integrated with the forecast hydrograph, so that during times of high water, the public will immediately have easy access to the forecast at the given location. And I'll jump back to the inundation map we had. You can see for the Waterloo map, the levee systems and the areas protected by the levee systems, the levee risk areas are highlighted on this map. And as the views are on the left-hand side of the pane, and also up and down on the inundation levels, the various inundation levels that are correlated with the stage at the gauge, the green dot in the middle, where the forecasts are issued, are displayed on the map. And you can see that we've mapped everything from bank full all the way up to and beyond the record event at this location. I'll talk about some of the technical details required to create one of these maps in just a few minutes, but notice that the map is of a reasonably short reach. We're not going, tens and 20s, we're not doing 50 plus miles in either direction, upstream and downstream on the river, and we're only tying this to one single point. The user's also got the ability to go in and look at the flood categories at this location, so you can see what major, moderate, and minor flood stage means at a particular location. And if there is a forecast out at a given time, you can look and view the current forecast at a location. It's going to give you a text warning here that there is no forecast available, because obviously it's not flooding right now in Waterloo. But that is something that can be viewed by the public during a time of high water and when the forecast is issued. So that's basically what the maps are and how they function. And before I talk about the technical details, one thing I do want to point out about these partner mapping projects is experience has shown that it is important to get the message out in as many different locations as you possibly can about the impacts of flood warning or from inundation. So that's kind of the concept behind having these products on multiple websites. So we've got the ability to show the public what's going to happen, not only on the IPAS site, but also on the Weather Service site. And hopefully they'll make good use of it. Another thing that we know is the social science that we know about the way people use warning information is they tend to shop around. If we display a certain product on the Weather Service's website, and for example, the USGS or another agency, such as the Iowa Flood Center, displays a similar product, we want to make sure that those products are in sync. And in this case, they definitely are. These were collaborative projects between the two agencies. And so when the public goes out and sees this information, this confirms that they're going to get an impact. And they've looked at the Weather Service site, possibly the Iowa Flood Center site, and done some comparison. They've seen that the data is the same. So that's a very powerful thing that's been put into place to help motivate people to take charge and react during a flooding situation by making sure that the information that they see is consistent across the agencies. So I'm going to jump back to the presentation here. First of our second slide. We're going to move on to topic 3, and I'm going to talk briefly about the technical challenges of developing flood inundation mapping projects. And you can see on the map that I showed that the regions that we're doing are relatively short. Again, we're not doing 50 miles of the river, we're doing a local area, and that's for very good reason. The key difference between this project approach and say, for example, a FEMA project approach is the FEMA studies, they load flows all down the river, all up and down the river. If you look at a 100-year event, you can see 100-year flows loaded all up and down that river. We don't have that luxury during an actual event. What happens during an actual event is you may get a variety of flows loaded upstream and downstream from the gauge. The gauge is your check on reality. So as the event unfolds, the flows may be higher on the upper end, lower on the lower end, or could be completely swapped. Could be lower on the lower end of the river and higher on the lower end of the river. And anyway, the idea is that it's very difficult in a forecast context to come up with a static map that fits all situations. So you have to be very, very careful about the reach lengths on a static mapping approach such as this. The only way to do long reaches of river is to do real-time dynamic modeling where you're running a HEC-RAS or another unsteady type model in real time and loading the flows that are actually materializing during an event. Otherwise, you risk being wrong. And we do not want to risk being wrong and misinforming the public. So we have chosen to size the reach in a way that we feel that the upstream and downstream reaches are within a foot or two of what actually might show up during an event. And that's all tied and anchored to that gauge. So that's one important aspect of how these maps are put together. Another important aspect of how these maps are put together is that the gauge that the maps are anchored to as the reality check and where the forecasts are issued for, the rating curve that we use for that gauge is consistent between the mapping product and the forecast side. And what I mean by that is, in order to produce a forecast at a gauge, what we've got to do, we've got a whole operations center that the Weather Service maintains called a river forecast center. And so these are the folks that are running the hydrologic models in real time. And what they're doing when they're running those hydrologic models is routing flows from upstream to downstream, and they're making sure that those flows balance and that the rainfall that's showing up or that's forecast to show up within an area and is going to translate to a valid flow at that gauge. And so that flow at that gauge is ultimately what provides the stage and the forecast of the stage. So what's really important is how much flow is moving past that gauge. And does that flow that's moving past that gauge, the rating curve that is used to establish the flow and the stage relationship at that gauge from the hydrologic model, does it match the hydraulic model that was used to produce the maps? It's very important that those two match. If they don't match, you're going to end up with a situation where the mapping doesn't match reality or doesn't match with the forecast. And that can be a challenge, especially in a gauge where we don't have a long record or where maybe the measurements aren't as robust. But we want to make sure that the forecast matches with the inundation maps. Those are probably the two key technical challenges that go into mapping, developing the forecast component of the maps. And then the other thing, of course, is making sure that you've got a valid model, that you've got good LiDAR terrain data support the model. We're very fortunate in Iowa to have statewide LiDAR available. So all of those go into producing an effective mapping product to be used in a warning context. You guys want to comment on anything else that I might have overlooked?
Well, I guess in addition to the LiDAR, I pointed to Dan and Tony earlier, when we develop these maps, we go out and do a comprehensive river survey, get a very detailed depiction of the river, incorporate that with the LiDAR data, collect as much information as we can about low-head dams, bridges, and other structures that might affect flow or inundation area. So the quality and accuracy of the data we put into these models is very critical in terms of making sure that they perform properly.
And regarding the Waterloo area, we did engage the local community officials in the city of Waterloo. They helped us review the maps, as well as the emergency management agency of Blacktop County. They reviewed the maps as well. And we, like I said, we engaged them during the process. We're very happy with the results, as most of our partners are, because it allows you to visualize what's going to get wet when we have to flood on the river.
All right, I think we'll move on to our last discussion point here. Future vision for developing flood inundation mapping in Iowa at the state and at the federal level. And I'll let you start with this.
So our future vision is just to continue as we have. As you saw on the map I showed earlier, we've got 4 additional communities upcoming this year. We plan to continue to add to the list in years to come. We are getting to a point, we started this effort in 2008, just after the 2008 flood. So some of our maps are starting to become a little bit dated. There have been mitigation efforts in some of the communities that have taken place. And so now we're going back and revisiting some of these communities and updating the maps to make sure they're reflective of the current situation in each community. We hope to continue to work closely with the National Weather Service to transfer our data to their web interface to, again, broaden access and make sure people are really taking advantage of these data sets to help them in their planning.
On the federal side, we certainly plan to continue the AHEB's flood mitigation mapping program. We rely, we're dependent on the partnerships that we form with the Iowa Flood Center and other federal and non-federal agencies that produce the mapping data. We don't have an in-house staff to do this type of modeling. We are entirely dependent upon partnerships to do this type of modeling and dependent upon the communities to provide data and a small amount of funding to get the data onto the web. So this program will continue. Beyond the immediate partnerships and the mapping that was discussed here, the Weather Service does have some longer-term initiatives that are under development to unify the federal approach to non-regulatory flood inundation mapping, and this is going to be through a consortium of federal agencies that includes the USGS, the Army Corps of Engineers, and NOAA's National Weather Service. And this consortium is known as the Integrated Water Resources Sciences and Services Initiative. And right now, a team of these agencies are working to develop inundation mapping requirements or uniform inundation mapping requirements so that we can all work together and provide the nation with a uniform set of inundation mapping services across the USGS, the Corps of Engineers, and NOAA's National Weather Service. And so the users of these mapping services should be able to see consistent information across the federal agencies. And again, with what we know about the social science aspect of using this type of data during an event or emergency, it's very important to maintain that consistency. So that is a long-term vision for flood inundation mapping, at least in the next 5 to 10 years for the federal government.
So again, I'd just like to mention that the next two presentations for the floodplain management track are not going to be able to be here today. So we have plenty of time for questions. I'll keep the panel up here, or if you guys have time for questions, we can definitely sit here and entertain other questions. Questions? Yes?
Understand you're talking about non-regulatory but later today there's going to be a list of sections for this new federal executive order where they talk about wanting communities to use what they call the best available actionable hydraulic and hydrologic data and methods. Okay. Well, I think one of the biggest complications with community buy-in, from my perspective, is the lack of accuracy in the flood insurance rate maps, and how much that impacts property owners, business, residential, whatever it is, and the amount of time that we spend in cities as floodplain administrators correcting the errors that, people are being told they need a certain amount of insurance and they don't, and so it creates this sort of suspicion and mistrust. What is it going to, have you any idea of why it is that the flood insurance rate maps can't be as fluid, if you will? Why do they have to be these static, one-dimensional products that don't convey the same kind of accuracy as you all are developing in your products? Why does there have to be that separation? Do you have any perspective on that at all?
So I'll speak to the quality of the maps, I guess, first. And I think we're beginning to address that now. The Flood Center and DNR, Scott Ralston's in the audience here. He's the floodplain mapping coordinator for the DNR. We have a statewide floodplain mapping program where the Flood Center has taken on all areas that either been previously unmapped or were Zone A or approximate study mapping areas, and restudying those using the LiDAR data. So that's going to greatly improve those floodplain boundaries and make them more consistent with the community's expectations and their experiences. So I think that's going to help us build their confidence. For the Zone 80 work, we and other contractors are working with the DNR to do either redelineations, to take the old model results and redelineate them on the LiDAR data. So we're not really looking at new flows or new model results, but just adjusting the boundaries so they fit with the LiDAR topography in many communities. And then in some communities, we're actually going in and restudying, revisiting the hydrology, rerunning the hydraulic models, and creating new maps, again, using the LiDAR data and the most up-to-date, highest quality information. So I think that's going to help. As far as making them consistent with these maps product, I think the challenge is that they are statistically based, and every additional year you have a new piece of information that changes the statistics. So the 100-year flood in Des Moines that they calculated in the year 2000 is not the same 100-year flood that's calculated most recently, 2010, I think was the last. So that's a challenge. They're always kind of chasing the statistics because they're changing. And so they have a relatively short shelf life because of that. That addresses your question.
Yeah, I just don't understand why it seems like there's just such reluctance on the insurance end of it to use a product other than, because even if a community has better maps, if that community doesn't go through the steps to have that officially turned into a new flood insurance rate map, then we're still dealing with the same issues.
Yeah, to date, we've got about 30 counties that we've completed, and we've had meetings, called draft flood hazard product review meetings with those 30 counties. In general, the reception has been very good, both when we're revising maps, and they can compare them to the old maps, and in many cases, the paper maps. And of course, in an unmapped county, you're presenting them for the first time, and people don't have the background of the insurance, so they really don't. If they knew everything, they'd probably be more scared, I think, because of the insurance rates and all that. But we're sort of hitting them cold with it. They really don't have an experience base with which to be suspicious.
Comments, one, then we've got the risk map product coming out, which is still static, but maybe a little less static than typical permanent. Nate, I think I know the answer to this, but the inundation mapping products do not reflect any flood fighting activities or flood fighting type of measures that might be taken as far as it is still based on a static sort of landscape that's out there, correct?
Correct. So they take into account any structural measures
That are in place.
If we have access to a community's flood response plan, then any temporary measures that are in that plan have been included.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So Iowa City's a good example.
Other questions, comments? I mean, we do have time, the room is open, so for those that, yeah, go ahead.
Could you just kind of walk through where the information is available through the National Weather Service site?
I'll back out a little bit here. So go into water.weather.gov. And at the bottom of this map, there is a link here that says inundation mapping location, second from the bottom on the left. That will take you to kind of an overview map of the 120 plus locations across the country where we've done these projects, and you can simply zoom in and click on the map of interest in Iowa.
And I think you already answered this. It's been a concern when we first started doing inundation mapping years back about cartographic standards being set nationwide, set for inundation mapping. That is occurring, has occurred.
I'm sorry, I can't hear it.
That nationwide cartographic standards have been established for inundation mapping projects.
We're working on that as far with the IRIS consortium. That is definitely our focus. And there are requirements that are being developed to address specific cartographic standards between the agencies.
So it'll be seamless essentially once those standards are in
Right.
place.
If you had a service that the Corps was providing, and it shouldn't look any different than what the weather service provides, it should appear seamless and useful.
Hey, you said something about gathering data for the channel itself, because that's one of the major deficiencies of LiDAR. They can't see through the water surface and see what's underneath it. How extensive is your survey work? Are you just looking at reaches near the gauge to make sure your radiators are reasonable? Or how do you go about that?
So the surveys are performed along the entire river reach of interest. So anything that's reflected in the maps, we go along the entire river channel. And depending upon accessibility, we've got two different technologies we use. One is kind of a scientific grade fish finder that measures the depth immediately below the boat as it's along its path. And then we have a multi-beam echo sounder which measures very highly detailed information about the riverbed and the swath. So we'll move upstream and downstream in a pattern to get full coverage of the riverbed and resolve features of the bed that are moving down to the few inches scale. And when those data are available, of course, we have continuous information along that entire reach. With the scientific grade fish finder, we do our best to try and keep the spacing of our transects across the river about the same as the total width of the river, or less. So not necessarily continuous, but fairly dense. And then we'll tie that all together with a land survey to connect all the structural features and the topography together with the riverbed.
Or I can attest to a lot of miles walking in waders.
Oftentimes, now that we've covered a lot of the larger communities that have larger rivers, Dan and Tony are venturing out to these small rivers that have very little flow most of the year. We're having to wade quite a bit.
All right, well, that looks like all of the questions we have in here. The panel will be around probably between now and I think we have lunch in about a half hour. So if you have offline questions you don't want to ask in front of the group, I think they're probably willing to stick around. Thank you.